You know, every major crisis kind of forces a hard look in the mirror, and that's what we're doing today. We're going to dive into how Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are responding to the UK's official COVID-19 inquiry. This isn't just about pointing fingers, it's about rewriting the entire rulebook to make sure the UK is actually ready for whatever comes next.
And really, it all boils down to one fundamental question, doesn't it? How does a country truly learn from its mistakes? It's one thing to promise you'll do better, but it's a whole other challenge to build systems that actually stop the same failures from happening all over again. And that is the massive task facing the UK right now. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get a handle on what the inquiry actually said. Then, we'll see how each of the nations are kind of cleaning up their own houses. And then we'll get to the big one. How are they all planning to work together? Finally, we'll look at the new systems they're building to make sure these lessons actually stick around.
Okay, so let's start with the report that really kicked all of this off, the Pandemic Preparedness Report. Because to understand the responses, you first have to understand what the inquiry was even looking for.
Now, this is a really crucial distinction. This report wasn't about the chaotic decisions made in the heat of the moment. No, it was a cold, hard look at the foundations. Were the UK's emergency plans, its systems, its structures, were they actually fit for purpose before the first case ever even arrived?
So a major finding was that decision-making was often just way too slow and confusing. The first step for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland has been to look inward and start fixing their own internal structures. They've all pretty much admitted their command chains were too complicated, and now they're trying to simplify. And in practice, what does that look like? Well, it means creating these new, high-level groups that are meant to cut through all the noise. Both Scotland and Wales are basically getting rid of layers of bureaucracy. They want to set up a single, clear line of sight for ministers. The goal is super simple. When a crisis hits, everybody needs to know exactly who is in charge of what.
And when you lay it all out like this, a pretty clear pattern starts to emerge, right? Scotland and Wales have set up almost identical quarterly meetings, and both are chaired at the Director General level. Northern Ireland is beefing up its own senior group. The message here is unanimous. Preparedness can't just be an afterthought. It needs consistent, high-level attention from the very, very top.
But Northern Ireland is actually taking it one step further. Not only are they reinforcing their internal teams, but they're also bringing in independent reviewers to audit their entire emergency planning system. That's a pretty bold move, and it shows a real commitment to getting an honest, unvarnished look at what really needs to change. But you know, fixing things internally is only half the battle. All of this leads to the most complex piece of the puzzle. How do the four nations work together? This question, it gets right to the heart of that often tense relationship between the devolved governments and Westminster.
On the surface, everyone wants to play nice. This quote from the Northern Ireland executive is pretty typical. All three governments are on record saying they're committed to collaboration and a UK-wide approach. But, as we're about to see, it's the details of that approach where things start to get, well, contentious.
And here it is. This is where the polite agreement ends and the real politics begin. See, the UK government's default is this lead government department model, where one ministry in London basically takes charge. Well, that does not fly with the devolved nations. Scotland's response is just a blunt no. Wales points out the model's limitations, which is a very diplomatic way of saying it doesn't work. And Northern Ireland is asking for clarity on how a top-down model respects its local authority. It's the classic dynamic, right? Everyone agrees to cooperate, but nobody wants to be told what to do by London.
So, if the structures are changing and the grand strategy is still being debated, how do you make sure these lessons actually stick for the long term? Well, that brings us to the absolutely crucial theme of accountability. To make these lessons stick, the nations are trying to create a new accountability loop. It starts with regular exercises to stress test the plans. Then, and this is key, the findings from these tests have to be published. After that, they'll bring in external red teams to challenge their own thinking. And finally, they have to report back to their own parliaments, which closes the loop and starts the whole cycle all over again.
And this isn't just theory. It's not some far-off idea. Step 1 is already on the calendar. All three devolved governments have committed to a major UK-wide pandemic exercise planned for this autumn. This is going to be the first real test of whether this new spirit of four-nation collaboration can actually work in practice.
And that commitment to transparency, step 4, that's also being put into action. Each nation is now publicly promising to report on its state of readiness directly to its own parliament.
This creates this really powerful cycle of accountability, and it forces preparedness onto the political agenda in Cardiff, Belfast, and Edinburgh.
So after going through all of these documents, all these plans, what's the big picture? What's the key takeaway as the nations of the UK get ready for the, let's face it, inevitable next crisis?
So what's the bottom line? Look, there is genuine progress here. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are all building stronger, more accountable emergency systems. They absolutely agree on the need to work together. But, and this is the critical part, they are making it crystal clear that any collaboration has to be a partnership of equals, not a top-down relationship controlled from Westminster.
And that leaves us with one final massive question. The rule books are being rewritten, the systems are being reformed, the command chains are being simplified, but in the face of some unknown future threat, will it actually be enough?